cheap thrill may cost you your life.
The food source is here, they're there. It's that simple.
More and more lives will be lost if foolhardy surfers jump into the open sea.
Can you imagine trying to swim away from that? Forget it.
Oh, no, I think sharks are one of the most beautiful creatures you can find in the ocean.
The white shark hugs the bottom because it looks above to hunt its prey.
That was their domain, that's where they belonged. We didn't belong there.
Because of the number of incidents of sharks approaching people in the water, there's been a lot of fear and a lot of reaction, and all sorts of measures are being considered.
And the advice from Surf Life Saving NSW, a non-profit that promotes water safety, is to just go to a local pool.
It's not okay being scared to our life.
This shark attack's happened in my street, on my beach.
It's never been like this.
Mate, I've said it before. If you've seen the beasts I've seen out there while I've been fishing, there's no way in the world you'd be out there surfing.
I guess if your totem was the shark, then you care for the shark, but then you also care for its habitat. When it's feeding time for them, why would you go and swim with them? And that's that understanding. When you gain knowledge of something, you actually start to respect it.
Hello everybody, welcome to Crossing the Tideline podcast. Brett Burcher here. We are going international this ep and speaking to Dr Chris Lowe, a renowned professor of marine biology and the director of the Shark Lab at California State University, Long Beach. Chris is a leading expert on juvenile white shark behaviour, tracking technology and beach safety. Lowe has led the lab for over 2 decades, focusing on shark conservation and human-shark interactions. I was curious to talk to Chris as he is on the ground daily putting in groundbreaking work along the Californian coast, which is a juvenile great white hotspot. Their operations and the way they manage shark tracking, mitigation and incident response share similarities but also differences to here in Oz. And I want to hear about what it is they are up to and get a good read on some of the crossovers and things that we could potentially implement here. Also, the behavioural similarities and differences observed with great white sharks between Oz and Cali. What really impressed me was the effort and importance they put on education, signage and shark perception in California. A weapon of a guy with so much knowledge and ability to explain info in a clear and rational way. This chat was recorded on the 23rd of February, 7 a.m. Dr. Chris Lowe, thank you for joining Crossing the Tideline podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So, Chris is a renowned professor of marine biology and the director of Shark Lab, which is at California State University, Long Beach. So he's a leading expert on juvenile white shark behaviour, tracking technology and beach safety. He's led the lab for over 2 decades, focusing on shark conservation and human-shark interactions. So I was really curious to talk to you today, Chris, as you're just on the ground daily, like putting in sort of groundbreaking work along the Californian coast, which is a juvenile hotspot as far as I'm aware. And just interested in the operations, the similarities and differences between what goes on here in Oz. So are you able to quickly just share a bit about yourself and then what the lab is all about and what you guys are getting up to on a daily basis?
Sure. Well, I've been at the Shark Lab now for 27 years. The Shark Lab at Cal State Long Beach is one of the oldest shark research labs in the country. It was founded by a guy named Don Nelson in 1966, who was he was the shark behavior guy. So I came to work with him as a grad student in the late 80s. And sadly, Don passed away in 1997, but I was hired as his replacement in 1998. So I took over the lab since then. But, what's really interesting is that history, right? So, the shark labs around the country really started in the late 50s. And that was because there was a big Navy interest in sharks. After World War II, morale was really low, especially after incidents like the USS Indianapolis, right? Where hundreds of men were bitten by sharks that went into the water. So the military was really keen to come up with shark repellents. So they were reaching out to the scientific community to find shark scientists, and they quickly found that there weren't any. They were just people that studied fish, right? but they said, look, we're looking for somebody to help develop shark repellents, and they waived a little bit of money, and that's usually all you have to do for some biologists. And they go, well, we'll help you, but we need to understand how those animals perceive their environment. We really know nothing about their senses, how they see, how they smell, how they hear. So the earliest days of shark research were really, guys like Nelson and Sonny Gruber and those guys that were focused on studying the sensory biology of sharks, how they perceive their environments. And then once they started to get a handle on that, then the military is like, okay, where's our repellents? So they started working on, electrical repellents and chemical repellents. And even as a grad student in the shark lab, I remember testing electrical and chemical repellents and thinking, man, these things just don't really work. Well, they do maybe part of the time, but I wouldn't bet a farm on it in terms of keeping me safe. So, that was my early history. And then, of course, coming back and taking over the shark lab, our biggest focus was, on behavior of sharks. What do they do? Where do they go? Where do they spend their time? What are they doing while they're in certain habitats? And then when do they leave? How far do they travel? So we quickly found that knowing those sorts of things wasn't just valuable in terms of our understanding of these sharks for science. We found that lifeguards really wanted to know that information. So that was how we got our first state funding to support the California Shark Beach Safety Program.
Great. And what year was that when you first got the funding and that kicked off?
So that was 2018 when we first got that funding. And that was my first toe dabbling in politics, which is horrible. Science is so much easier and safer than dealing in politics. But in a way, it was kind of really important and essential to do because, we were basically going out and tagging sharks. We had maybe $15,000 a year.
Wow.
And that was it. We were getting funded by Monterey Bay Aquarium. And it wasn't really a lot of money. But what happened was, sharks started showing up everywhere at beaches and they would be there all summer long. And lifeguards were asking us those questions, like, what are they doing here? What sharks are here? Are there sharks here that we can't see? How often are they here? What are they doing while they're here? What are they eating? And do they pose a threat to people? And we said, those are all great questions. Believe it or not, we have the tools to answer those questions. We just don't have the money. So that was when we got funding. So we got $3.75 million for 5 years. And so far we've made that last almost 7. But we're running out of money. It's just the way it goes.
Is there interest in trying to renew the money? Because it seems to me like what you've done in that 7 years is outstanding. Like surely they're keen to keep going?
Yeah, they are. We have a lot of great supporters. Our community is very supportive. Our state legislators are very supportive. A lot of the cities and counties are very supportive. We get about $300,000 in in-kind support from beach cities and counties. That's just lifeguards taking us out in their boats and helping us. They're great. Unfortunately, California has a budget deficit this year, so it's a tough time to go to the state and ask for more money. But we did get some private foundation money that's kept us going from the Paul M. Engel Foundation, which have been great in terms of supporting shark work.
And so before they the lifeguards came, I'm especially interested in the lifeguards coming because it's crucial information for them to know. Were they previously just running off an idea and a belief that's been sort of shaped through culture or what? I guess what my question is, what was happening on the coast? Like how many injuries, how many bumps, how many fatalities were generally occurring per annum or in any way you're able to measure that? And then was there an increased shark presence which made the lifeguards curious or was it just what happened there?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at shark-related injuries in California, and I'm just going to focus on injuries, not bumps and things like that, because some of those things are really hard to document, and sometimes lifeguards, were even questioning some of the occurrences, right, where there's no injury. And then they would close a beach, right? And the next thing you know, there's only one dude out there surfing, and the dude that's out there surfing is the dude that reported getting bumped.
Bit of crowd control.
So a little, there was some of that stuff going on. But, we still had bites. On average, we have about 3 bites per year in California. And those are 97% of those are attributed to white sharks. So those are not minor injuries, right? Those are pretty significant injuries. So, when we look at that variance over the course of the last 50 years, it has gone up a little bit, but per capita, it's gone down. So that's the other thing that's really interesting because, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I just started Shark Lab, if somebody came up to me and said I would be able to go off any Southern California beach and find a white shark any day of the week, I would have said, that's bullshit. But I can tell you now, pretty much any day of the week, I can take somebody out and show them a white shark. And if you'd asked me 30 years ago if this would have been possible, I would have said, no way. So clearly we're seeing more sharks. And we started to notice this about 15 years ago. And I think that the thing that was so surprising is how quickly things have changed. 15 years ago, we started hearing about these little pockets of juvenile sharks, mainly young of the year. So they're about 1.25 meters, 1.5 meters long when they're born. So that's what people were seeing off the beach. But now, we're getting juveniles that are up to 3 meters. They're hanging out at the same beaches they did when they were 1.5 meters. And they're kind of doing the same things they did when they were 1.5 meters. But now they're 3 meters long. They're bigger than most longboards. So when surfers see those sharks swimming around out there, they go, well, is this safe? So, we've got 6 years worth of data now to show that those sharks are in and amongst people pretty much every day. Most people don't know they're there, and people just aren't being bit. So what it's doing is it's kind of rewriting the rules of what a lot of people thought about the danger, at least of juvenile white sharks. Now, I have to remember, in parts of California, you go further north, especially this time of year, and it's not just juveniles, right? So we have subadults and adults, sharks up to, getting up around 5 meters. They're big sharks, and they are there specifically to feed on seals. So that's the main draw in the winter, is to feed on northern elephant seals, which form these rookeries. And the sharks are kind of hanging out in those spots, trying to get a good seal meal.
Yeah, I want to get to Northern Cali later on in the combo, because I think I see the coastline sharing similarities with Australia. I see Cali as like almost the East Coast, but then the South Australian waters in Oz remind me a lot of the Northern Cali waters, where the water gets cooler, it becomes more reef, it's more alive. And so would love to get to that later and see what you found out up there. And I do know that you had a fatality, I think, late last year that was up near Santa Cruz, which was tragic. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. Again, amazing work you've done over 7 years, and a crazy snapshot. Like, I've got to give props to the lab's Instagram page. I guess in the last year, it seems like you put a lot of effort into making these 1 to 2 minute videos that are so informative. And you just sort of say, like, what are we looking for? This is what we found, and this is why. Then you've got supporting visuals to back it up. And so, there's 3, you're saying in an annual year, there's 3 bites. And you're saying that generally, you can just chuck a drone up and find a great white shark at pretty much any beach in Cali. And my friend Nick and I have got this saying here that when we're in the water, we always reckon we're within 500 meters of a shark. Like, that's just, and we've kind of always felt that, I think. But now with the drone surveillance, you're kind of knowing that. Just in terms of, let's just go into behaviour, like what they're doing on the, let's say they're always there and they're only coming into contact with someone injury-wise 3 times a year. What are they up to on the day-to-day? Like, what are they doing?
Yeah. So that's one of the biggest questions we've been trying to chip away at. And the great thing is we have all this technology available, right? So between the drones, which give us a snapshot of what they're doing, but primarily when they're at the surface. But then through the tagging, we have all this tagging technology. We have acoustic tags that have depth and temperature sensors on them. We have data loggers that we can put on them that have cameras that give us a high resolution but short snapshot of what they're doing over the course of a day. And we get things like how fast they're swimming or direction and heading and what they're encountering because it's got a camera on it. So all these things have kind of given us insight. And what we find is that based on their behavior, it looks like most of the efforts to feed are around dawn and dusk. And the reason we make that statement is because we see them near the bottom the most during dawn and dusk. We see them swimming the fastest during dawn and dusk. And when we look at their stomach contents, the favorite things that they like to eat are on the bottom. So for the juveniles, it's stingrays, it's guitar fish, it's benthic fish like halibut and things like that. Those are the things they're feeding on at those size classes, right? So most of that activity on the bottom where those things are is at dawn and dusk. The rest of the day, actually, they're just kind of chilling out. So a lot of times when we see them, at least swimming at the surface, they're almost in a daze. It's almost like they're zoned out. We've even seen this cool behavior where they'll swim in these circles, like a 10-meter diameter circle for 20 minutes in one direction. And then we'll reverse and go in the opposite direction for 20 minutes and then do it again. And they'll do that for like 4 hours. So when we started looking at these data, we're like, what the heck is going on? Is this because of the tag or what? So one of the things we found was that, in the literature, researchers have studied migratory birds and actually put these little EEG hats on their heads and measure their brain waves. And these birds continuously fly while they migrate. What they found was they would turn off half their brain and fly in a circle one direction. Then they'd turn off the other half of their brain and fly in a circle in the opposite direction. And that way they wouldn't get lost while they were resting. So whales do this, dolphins do this. It's called unihemispheric sleep, where they turn off half their brain and the other half helps them come to the surface to breathe and things like that. So white sharks must continuously swim in order to breathe. And we think that behavior that we see is one trick that they use to maybe rest while they continuously swim, but don't get off track or get lost. So it's been little things like that we've learned that they spend, at least 4 hours in the afternoon just tooling around in circles. So we see that quite often from the air as well. So we have drone footage to back that up. So it's all these sorts of things that we piece together, looking at their diet, just taking a little muscle biopsy, we can tell what they're eating. If we catch them, we can swab their butts and actually get DNA from the things that they've eaten. So we can identify what they've eaten just by what's coming out, the back end. So, by using all these tools, we have a much better idea what the sharks are doing on a day-to-day basis. And by and large, we think they're hanging out there at these beaches because it's safe. Just safe. They don't know they're a white shark yet. They're cruising around. They're no parental care. They're done on their own since mom pupped them out. And by being in these shallow beach habitats where there's lots of food, the water's warm, they can grow fast. They're avoiding big things that can hurt them. So it just so happens that same habitat is where people like to hang out and play.
Now, they're being born at 1 meter to 1.5 meters, and then you're saying a juvenile can still be considered up to 3 meters. How many years is that between the 1.5 and the 3 generally?
Well, we estimate that they grow about 25 centimeters a year for their first 6 years, right? So, that puts them up around, 8 years old, 9 years old by the time they're 3 meters, depending if it's a male or female. We think females grow a little faster.
So the 3 meter ones that you're starting to see around Cali, you've probably seen them as babies at the beginning of the program, perhaps.
In fact, we've tagged some as babies. And because we put 10-year tags in them, we've been able to track individuals for 8-9 years now. And by the time they're 2 or 3 years old, they're visiting the offshore islands off California. By the time they're 6 years old, they're heading to places like Guadalupe Island, which is 150 miles off the California or the Mexico coast. They're going to Hawaii by then. So, by the time they're between 6 and 8, they're starting to act more like, do a little bit what the adults do, go offshore more.
Now, Yes, I think I've got this stat right. You said that 97% of the time that you go up to observe a great white, put a drone up, you'll see one. That was on your page.
At
Like
aggregation sites, yeah.
At aggregation sites.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how, with humans being in there a lot of those times, how do they not identify us as food?
That's a great question. So the drone survey stuff that we did was really kind of critical. Like, we had to know how often were these sharks in close proximity to people, and what did that mean? Like, what is close proximity, right? So the trick with drones, especially in Southern California, is our water clarity is not great. So you can really only see the sharks from the upper 2 meters of the water column, right? So they got to be near the surface. But because it's a beach, quite often, the water's fairly shallow. So, this grad student who did the study flew 26 beaches across all of Southern California every month for 3 years. And the only place where we saw consistently white sharks in close proximity to people, less than 20 meters, was at these aggregation sites. And at non-aggregation sites, we'd see ones and twos, maybe one or two sharks swimming by, but that would be it. But at the aggregation sites, we would see up to 40 white sharks. These are juveniles between 1.5 meters and 3 meters long at one beach. So as you can imagine, at those beaches, in the early days, when we first started flying those surveys, we told the lifeguards, look, if we ever see a white shark within, 30 meters of a person, we'll call you so you can alert them and pull them out of the water. By the end of the week, the lifeguard said, stop calling, because it was happening like every 10 minutes. So they began to realize, and we began to realize, those sharks are hanging out there day in, day out, week in, week out. And our telemetry data, our tagging was telling us the same. And that the surfers and swimmers couldn't see them. So even though they're swimming right underneath them, we could easily see them from the drone. They could not see them from their board. Stand-up paddlers could see them more often, and they would be the ones that would report seeing white sharks. But rare for swimmers or surfers to report seeing white sharks while they were out in the water. So that kind of got us thinking about, well, why do some sharks seem to approach people? And does it vary? In other words, can they tell the difference between a swimmer, a surfer, or paddler, that sort of thing? So that spawned the next research project that one of my grad students has been working on. So from the drone footage, we'll see a shark orient to a person, let's say a swimmer, from about 20 meters away. Now, both are at the surface. There's no way the shark can see the swimmer from that distance, but yet it clearly would orient to them, get within 1 meter or so of that person, and then turn away and then take off. So the question we were asking is, what cue is the shark using to locate that object? So we hypothesized that was hearing or vibration that person was giving off. So my grad student, Whitney Jones, did this project where we got this special hydrophone that we put in the water. And that hydrophone also measures water displacement, vibration. And we had students swim between buoys, and we recorded the sounds that they made as they swam between these buoys at different speeds. And then we put them on a surfboard to have them paddle between the buoys. And then we put them in a kayak and had them paddle between the buoys. And the first question was, do the sounds in the frequencies that sharks can hear, or the vibration levels that they can feel, within the shark's range, do they differ? In other words, could a shark tell the difference between a swimmer, a surfer paddling, and a kayaker paddling? And what Whitney found was that the sounds are distinct, right? So a surfer sounds different from a swimmer, sounds different from a paddler, as long as they're paddling at the same frequency, right? So same stroke rate, that sort of thing. So what we then did was say, okay, now we know it's within their hearing range or their detection range. So now to do a hearing test, we had a special speaker. We go out in the water, go to one of the aggregation sites and play the sounds back to them and randomize them to see, are they more attracted to the sound of a swimmer than, say, a surfer or paddler? So we hypothesized that because the sharks are at this aggregation site are already around people all the time, and there were people around where we're doing these studies, maybe they won't respond to the sound at all. So what we found was just that. A lot of times Whitney's playing the sounds back. We randomize the pattern at which we play the different sounds, and quite often we get no response. until she turned the volume up. When she turned the volume up and make it louder than normal, suddenly we would see sharks respond. Okay, so this is kind of interesting, right? So our hypothesis was they shouldn't respond because they're around people all the time. In other words, they recognize those sounds. So they tune them out. So the question was, why are people being bitten at these beaches? So one of many people's favorite hypotheses is the reason white sharks occasionally bite swimmers or surfers is for mistaken identity. So our question here is, if you have all these sharks around all these people every single day, isn't it highly likely that a shark could make a mistake and accidentally bite a person, swimmer or surfer? And because your numbers are high of both people and sharks continuously throughout the day, shouldn't that probability go up? So this little experiment was really testing that hypothesis. And it turns out, we think, that the sharks can recognize the sounds that people make. They probably even recognize their odors that we make and our silhouettes. But because we're not food and we do not pose a threat, they just ignore us. So, and that's basically what this experiment has showed. Now, every once in a while, Whitney would have a shark that would respond to the sound at its normal levels. And that is something very similar to what we would see sharks respond from the air, from a drone. So we suspect that shark either was new to the area, maybe it never encountered people before, or there's some unique characteristic, or the background noise was lower and therefore it sounded louder. So in any event, the experiment kind of is helping us explain why people are sharing the water with these sharks and we're not seeing bites.
Yeah, when you turn the volume up, what happened? Did the sharks move away?
No, they're actually interested. They're like, what is that? Yeah, they'll come not as close as they would to a real person, but they would orient to the sound. So they'd start moving towards it. And, I Southern California, so I live 400 meters from a major freeway. And when my wife and I first moved there, we were like, oh my God, I don't know how we're going to sleep. This freeway noise is horrible. I had a friend come visit, they were living in the mountains, they're like, what is that god awful noise? I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, that horrible freeway noise. And it just occurred to me that I've tuned it out, right? I've completely filtered it from my brain. But what's interesting is when the wind blows a certain direction, blows that sound right into my house, suddenly I hear it and it sounds louder. So we think that a lot of the response that we're seeing of sharks to these sounds is likely meaning that they're around these things all the time. Us, people, swimmers, surfers, out splashing, making crazy noises. We do not smell like food and we do not chase them. We don't even know they're there. So as a result, they just ignore us. And that's basically supported by hundreds of hours of drone footage. Sharks are swimming right underneath swimmers, not even changing course.
And then what do you put the 3 down to?
What do you mean?
Oh, sorry. You've got all these hours and hours of log footage of nothing happening, just curiosity when the noise gets turned off, then not interested. But then there's those 3 incidents where it does occur with a human interest. Like anything you've got for us there?
No. Every time we think we have some pattern, something blows it apart. I investigate all the bites in California. I'm part of the shark bite investigation team with the state, and I'm also with the International Shark Attack File. So our job is to kind of do the investigations, try to figure out what happened. I've been doing this for about 20 years. After investigating all these bites, we're always trying to look for motivation. I break them into 2 categories. A shark bites a person for defensive reasons or it bites a person for predation reasons. Very few people have flesh removed. They're often bitten, but flesh is not removed in most cases. So therefore, it's hard for us to say that sharks consider us food. And with all the people out there, if they did, you would expect bites to be much more frequent than they are. Then you're left with, well, I made a mistake. I thought this was something else, and I bit into it, and it turns out it doesn't taste anything like I thought it would. And oops, my bad. But why isn't that happening more often? So, I jokingly say, if there are mistakes, and I'm sure there are, that sharks don't make mistakes nearly as often as people do. I mean, we know that just based on our hundreds of hours of drone footage and telemetry data showing white sharks around people every single day, day in, day out. So then we're left with, well, maybe defense. So one of the things interesting is a couple of years ago, we had a swimmer who was bitten down at one of the aggregation sites. And again, there are thousands and thousands of people in the water with the sharks all summer long. We had a bad red tide, so visibility was horrible. The guy was swimming him, 100 meters off the beach, right in front of the lifeguard tower, when he felt something bump his chest. So as soon as he felt something bump his chest, he went vertical in the water, and the shark got him right across the chest. Still, it was a big juvenile, but kind of got him right, hit the ribs. So nothing major, a couple of perforations, some lacerations on his hand. Shark bit, and that was it. And he, swam to shore. Somebody helped him to shore. And the more I talked to him, and the more I looked at conditions, the more I began to wonder whether he startled the shark. Remember, I told you we know that these sharks will go into the sleep-like state, and we can literally drive right up to them next to a boat and dart a tag in their back that way. Or if you cast a shadow, suddenly they'll wake up and they'll come around behind you. I think the guy swam into the shark, startled it. And when he did that, the shark came back and got him. So how many times does that happen? So we always assume that the bites are predation related, but we never really consider defensive reasons. And it's a possibility. It's one that we definitely have to think about, right?
So to go back to that, I can't remember the term of when the half the brain's shut off, half the brain's awake. Do you think that half the brain, like being in an environment where they have to be somewhat alert, half that brain you would think would probably pick up the swimmer in close proximity to the shark? I know it's just a theory, but that's what the reason why they're leaving half that brain on is to notice if anything's coming within its zone. And then if a swimmer is coming in, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, that very well could be. But, I think about all the time I see people on their cell phones walking around the street and see them step out into traffic. They're focused on their phones, right? They're not listening or paying attention to what's happening around them. So, not that sharks are checking their cell phones, but if they're kind of half out of it and they're cruising along and there's all that similar noise that you recognize around you, how loud or close does it have to get before you go, oh, that's too close, right?
Yeah.
So it's possibility, certainly a possibility.
Yeah, these references to like the human population too, and like, there's always humans that make mistake, and there's because it feels to me like these aggregation sites, they're such a controlled way for you guys to observe and to understand patterns. And so within your 7 years of watching, especially pups come up to become, 8 years old, is there any times where you've had to watch closely a certain individual within that stock because you're like, this is acting just different? And, that could then lead to aggressive behaviors or unpredictable behaviors.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. We always look through our drone footage for that sort of, is the shark acting differently than the other sharks? Is it acting more aggressively? And we do annual workshops for all the lifeguards in California, all the ocean lifeguards. And we talk about all the things we've learned. And one of the things we try to give them is, what does an aggressive shark look like? Because that's part of the protocol if you're going to pull people out of the water. It used to be if an 8-foot shark was around, they'd pull people out of the water because we just assumed an 8-foot shark or, a little less than 3 meters is more likely to approach a board and therefore get close to a person. So maybe you should pull people out of the water. Then when we had all these sharks of all this size at these beaches, every single day the beach would be closed. So we added this behavioral component to it, right? So if the shark's acting aggressively, so the lifeguards would go, well, what does that look like? So we've looked through hundreds of hours of drone footage of sharks near people. We've never seen anything that we would characterize as aggressive behavior. However, we have seen sharks act aggressively towards each other and other marine life. And we use those videos as examples to show the lifeguards what we think aggression looks like. So if a big shark approaches a small shark and a small shark starts to get into space, you will start to see behavior that looks aggressive, like the shark zipping in towards the other one quickly moving away. But we've never seen them do that to a person. So that again adds to this phenomenon about, because sharks are around people all the time, and they were since they were young, maybe they've learned that these things are humans. They're not food. They really don't pose a threat. And by and large, you can ignore them because we're flotsam at a beach, right? With the things floating at the surface. So most of their activity, most of what they're doing is down below the surface. It's near the bottom. So I think, behaviorally, that's what makes these aggregations maybe a little different than other places. So it also raises these questions of, in the early days when, there weren't that many sharks around, would it be a higher likelihood of one of those juveniles biting a person because they didn't know what those objects were? And they weren't using those beaches as aggregation sites. So will this actually lower the chances of people being bitten in the future because they've been around them since they're young and they can identify them now as being non-threatening and non-food? So the question I always have is, will our ability to leave people in the water with them, in other words, we're not dragging them out every time a juvenile white shark is sighted, actually decrease the likelihood of bites in California's future?
Are you paying close attention to non-aggregation sites? And do you have your ears to the ground to, say, surfers from San Diego up to San Fran? Like, are they sort of filtering through info about what they're noticing, experiencing, and is there any patterns there or what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of folks that reach out when they see something or hear something or get some video of something, and they're good about really sharing it with us. We always fly and have receivers at non-aggregation site beaches. We sample at those places because our question is, why aren't there sharks here? So those are the other things that we're constantly looking at. And those aggregations form and break down and reform in different places. And the goal is to be able to predict where the next aggregation is going to be. So lifeguards really, of course, are keen to know that, because when you get an aggregation site at your beach, that makes your job much more difficult, right? So, and we had many lifeguards in the early days that, well, we've never had wet sharks at our beach. So we don't need any of this training. We don't need any of this. And then usually within a couple of years, they'll be like, oh, there's aggregation at our beach. We need that information now. So, these are things that we have learned. Lifeguards are learning. And it's actually reduced the number of beach closures in California. So we've saved coastal communities millions of dollars in what will be revenue lost due to not closing beaches.
I had this down as a question. You were saying that it can be between 30 and 250K a day to close a beach.
Yeah. So the economist that I'm working with is trying to get those numbers, and it's hard, right? California just doesn't have good, easy acquired economic numbers. So at beach communities where you have big surfing, activities and things like that, ocean activities, the estimates are, depending on the size of the beach, anywhere from $50,000 to $250,000 per day in lost revenue is kind of the back of the envelope guesstimate. When a bite occurs, however, there's a mandatory 2-day closure. And that usually gets national news, especially if it's in our spring coming into beach season for us, right? And then that balloons, right? That number gets bigger and the area around it gets bigger. So, and I don't know whether that's just people's geographical literacy or whether that just people are just worried about going to the beach altogether as a result of that media coverage, but that does influence that number quite a bit.
Yeah, we feel that in Australia. I mean, you don't have to be close to it, but I think these events, they ripple through the whole coast, and then therefore people feel like it has just happened at the beach out the front, and they feel tentative, and it changes their behaviour for that week, and I'm sure that would be the same there. Obviously because of that, like, I know it's not about revenue, but revenue lost would mean like, all right, well, how do we stop these beaches from being closed? Hence your amazing education program, which I think I want to get to after this question, because obviously the education has to come from tracking has to come from tagging. Now, you don't use drum lines like we do here in Australia. So here, our system is that we have the smart drum lines, the baited hook, a couple of 100 metres off the beach. And I think that has to be currently in Australia. I'm not sure. I'm sure that I want to hear later if you've got other ideas for things that we could be doing differently. But with it being so remote and there being such a large population, it feels currently like a double-edged sword. But how do you guys go about your tagging program? And I thought it was fascinating before you sort of said, do you try and wait for them to be in that half-brain state to come up and not sneak up, not be as obvious of a presence?
Yeah. So, what we've done is to address the questions that we wanted to address. The key was getting tags on sharks. And because we had lots of sharks in these areas in a fairly small area, right? And we're talking, maybe 6 kilometers stretch of beach. That's it. And then you get beyond that, nothing. Get the other side of that, nothing. So why this 6 kilometers? And what we found from our tagging is the sharks are literally just kind of going back and forth, day and night for months and months at a time. And then for some reason, individuals would leave, new individuals come in. So for us, the easiest way to get tags out and not influence the shark's behavior or minimize any impacts of behavior is literally going out in a boat. We have small, 5-meter Boston whaler. We could drive right up alongside the sharks using a drone. We can get a size. We can dip a camera underneath them to tell if it's a male or female. And then we can quickly dart an acoustic transmitter or a satellite transmitter into their back. If we catch the sharks, which we sometimes use a piece of net, just a piece of gill net, and we'll see the shark coming down the beach, we'll set the gill net in front of it. It'll get tangled. We can quickly grab the shark, flip it upside down. It goes to sleep, goes into tonic immobility. We can surgically implant a tag. We can take tissue and blood and all these other things, and then attach a variety of different tags and let them go. So by using combinations of these techniques, we've tagged over 380 sharks in the last 10 years. And some of the tags, like the ones we surgically implant to the sharks, will stay in there forever. And those transmitters have a 10-year battery life. So they've been really important in terms of helping us understand behavior over time and how that might change. But getting access to the sharks is really kind of the key. One of our challenges was we had, these aggregations of sharks at a public beach. And we didn't want to be looking like a bunch of yahoos out in a boat, even though we're wearing, shark lab shirts or whatever. So we work with lifeguards. Lifeguards are our partners. We're on lifeguard jet skis. We're on lifeguard rescue boats while we're doing these operations. They are there with us, helping us do this. That way we can ensure it's done safely, right? The public sees that the lifeguards are involved in this. So they become really important partners in this work. And the public then sees that it's not that the lifeguards aren't doing anything about this. Remember, because you might think in Australia, well, why aren't the lifeguards, closing the beach every time a white shark's sighted? Well, they're worried about that and their responsibility to the public. So, but their argument would be, well, we don't know whether that shark that we just closed the beach for is gone an hour later, because the shark lab found a shark can travel 60 miles in a day. So how do we know that shark just didn't leave and has never come back? So by participating in this research with us, they've become really good scientists and of themselves and are sharing that information with the public. So when the public comes back and goes, well, you said there's white sharks out there. And they go, yeah, we just saw some today. Well, why aren't you closing the beach? Because we don't need to. And here's why. So that I think has been kind of essential for us in doing this work. We could not do this work without their help.
And you're also you run workshops and you go and set up tents, right? And there's like booklets that you can grab at the beach. There's a lot of signage. Like, just give me a rundown on the depth you go to for education, because to me, it's almost as important as getting the data, right? Making sure that it is received and understood so that people feel reassured, and then there's like a cohesive feeling across the board.
Yeah, that was a key for us. When we get the funding, we decided really early on that a good chunk of that money had to go into education and outreach. Because what is the point of gathering the data if only scientists are going to use it, or if managers who are going to do something in a black box that the public doesn't understand why they're doing it. So from the very beginning, we had an education program where we would take the data that we were getting as we were getting it, and then giving it to the public. Here are the questions we're trying to answer. Here's what we've learned so far, but keep in mind, we're not done yet, right? So it could change. And that's become really important too, because that way they don't feel deceived. If something changes, and they said, well, you said this is the behavior. I said, this is what the data show now, but the data could show something different from now. And it's not some ruse just to keep me in funding. It's because the behavior really does change because the ocean changes. So I think our key was we started with lifeguards. They were our first client in terms of education. So we developed a curriculum just for them. We trained all the new lifeguards in Southern California, and we're now working on Central California, so that they all have this information. They're some of the best lifeguards in the world, but they're not marine biologists. So by giving them these tools, not only are they able to make better decisions when they're on the water, but they're really important ambassadors for the public because they interact with the public every single day. So then our next group that we wanted to engage were K through 12 kids. And that works great for locals, right? So we have locals that live, literally 20 kilometers inland that have never been to a beach, ever. They live 20 kilometers inland. So how do we get information to them? So if they do go to the beach, that they can be safe. So we have a big K through 12 program we call Operation Sharks and Robots. And that is, if you can't get kids interested in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math using sharks and robots, we've failed, right? But nested in with this education program is always beach safety information. Like, what's a rip current and how does it form and how do you get out of one? And then what is a stingray and how do you avoid getting stung by a stingray? Well, you do the stingray shuffle. So we go into all these things in K through 12 classrooms, and that has been funded by our National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association. So that is already heading to becoming a national program. Then we have our outreach. And our outreach is really designated for the general public, ages 3 to 90. And we use things we call shark shacks. They're pop-ups. We take them to beaches. During the summer, I hire about 20 undergraduates. They all get trained to go out and deliver this curriculum to the public. The exact same sort of pared down curriculum that we give to K through 12 students. So we talk about beach safety. We talk about how we study stingrays and how we study sharks, how to treat injuries that you might encounter because you're sharing the water with these animals. So if you do get injured, what should you do? So we kind of cover all of that in these shark shacks. So that becomes a really important factor. And we keep close tabs on how many people do we engage with, how do we get new information out to them. Then to feed that program, and the great thing about being at a university is I'm surrounded by all these brilliant people across all these different disciplines, right? So we decided, we need new infographics to get this information out. So I hired a bunch of art students who knew nothing about sharks or infographic or about, marine biology. And I said, look, we need you to come up with some cool infographics to help us educate and inform the public. And they go, well, we don't know anything about sharks and marine biology. And I said, that's why I need you. Because we need somebody who's going to look at it from a different lens than us. So we give them the information, and then we work with them, and then they come back and go, okay, here's what someone like me might think if I were looking at this infographic. And I'm like, this is perfect, right? Because that's the demographic that we're trying to reach, right? Animators, we get students that are doing animations, and they help us create all these animations, some of which you've seen in our social media reels, right? We teamed up with a psychologist. So the psychologist is helping us understand perceptions. What do people think about sharks? How do they feel about getting in the water at a beach where they knew there were white sharks sighted there the day before? And where did that perception come from for fear? And how do we change that perception? So those studies have been really instrumental in changing how we do our education and outreach. So for example, at Cape Cod, they have adult white sharks there. You drive into the National Seashore and you'll see these beautiful, huge signs of a gorgeous picture of an adult white shark. And then in big letters, it'll say warning, right? And they've actually seen people drive in the parking lot, look at the signs, get back in their car, drive away. So here, our city councils are like, please don't make signs that look like that. So again, we hire the student artists and we say, look, this is what we want to do. We want to educate people about this is a seal rookery. This is where the elephant seals come to haul out, and people love to go there. Some people like to surf and swim there. And we're like, when the seals aren't there, no problem. When the seals are there, you should be more cautious. So how do we design a sign that will educate and inform them without scaring the living shit out of them? So the idea there is art. So these art students come up with these really cool, beautiful art designs, explaining kind of an infographic form, the seasonal behavior of seals and sharks and what people can do. And, they really creative. One of them, has the sharks sending each other postcards from where they are as they're moving around the Pacific, right? And then people are just floating around in the center. And one of the things we've noticed from our surveys of how people interact with those signs is that if we ask them how many signs they saw in the parking lot, they would go, I don't know, 2, right? And then we'd ask them, well, did you see the sign about the sharks? They go, yeah, that was really cool. And we go, well, what about the other signs? And they go, what other signs? Well, there are 15 other signs in the parking lot. They're just regular text on white sign, didn't even look at them, but they looked at the art. And then we've asked people, have you been to the beach before? Yeah. Have you been to that sign before? Yeah. Why did you go back and look at it again? And they said, well, the first time I just looked at it for the art. The second time I read the text. So, well, did you get different things from it? And they go, absolutely. I learned a lot more the second time I looked at the sign. Now, psychologists have done all these studies about signage, right? And most people, if you're a quick read, you might even misread the sign and end up getting a parking ticket because the sign said no parking at this time. And you just assumed, you missed that part about the time, right? So the idea here is how can we use people's psychology to better understand and communicate to them without scaring them? And that's the key. That is really the key. We want them to change or modify their behavior because the animals they're going to be sharing the environment with won't be changing theirs necessarily.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much for that. Yeah. I think that in Australia we have Dr. Rip. It's just rips are like the thing that you learn about as a kid. And since I've been so interested in this, I'm like, why wouldn't there be a Dr. Shark or, and as you said, a Dr. Ray? And we just give them kids as soon as they're young this info that then they can probably go and feed on to their parents too, if they don't know. But then that signage and the way that you go about it, I think it's really clever and it sounds like it's effective. And so, that's got a lot to do with sort of pre-treatment. Yeah. And then I know that Callie's big on, post-treatment as well, first aid, ensuring that there's medical attention immediately, and then, the time frame of getting someone to extra help is worked on. Can you share some about that?
Yeah. So, and we start that early, like with kids. So, for example, I didn't mention this, one of our other big outreach tools are comic book series. We got a whole comic book series for kids, and they were actually geared towards junior lifeguards. So in Southern California, there are 20,000 junior lifeguards, kids between the age of 9 and 16, which it's kind of like lifeguard summer camp for these kids, So they're becoming better swimmers, they're learning first aid, they're learning those sorts of things. And we've incorporated this, marine wildlife component into that training. And mainly to give them information so that they can be safe when they're sharing the water with these animals. So that comic book series, we even start with first aid in there. So knowing full well that a kid is going to potentially step on a stingray, get nailed, what do they need to do about that? And how do they prevent it? And how do they treat it? So, that is kind of how we deal with the lower end education, right? But for lifeguards, we in our education, our workshop program that we do for them, we give them all the information that we've learned. But the last part of that workshop is, okay, what do you do if a bite occurs at your beach? And we've learned from lessons of beaches not being prepared. Lifeguards didn't have the right materials. They didn't have the right training. In some cases, they didn't, have the right protocols to follow. They're used to dealing with drownings or near drownings and those sorts of things. But something like this, completely different. So I bring in an ER doc who works in a trauma center. He was in the military, and he kind of goes through, look, he's investigated some bites. He's like, you have to treat these like combat wounds. These are, in US, we have stop the bleed programs because of gunshots. So everybody's learning how to use tourniquets and things like that. We have, tourniquet programs even for grade school kids now. But a tourniquet doesn't help you if you're bitten by a 5-meter white shark across the midsection, right? The question is, what do you do then? So in addition to just standard tourniquet technique, we talk about combat gauze. Do you have combat gauze in your kit? Do you know how to pack a wound? Do you know how to cover a gaping wound? Your first goal is to, reduce blood loss. So one of the things that we did in prepping for that part of the program was we did a case study where we looked at maybe the last 5 or 6 bites in Southern California. And this doctor that I worked with, this ER doc, basically noticed that a lot of these people were, within probably 15 minutes of going in shock from the time they were bitten to the time they were treated. So he was really curious as to how that pre-hospital response enabled them to survive and recover from those injuries. So he went all the way back to the first responders, talked to the victims, from the time they were bitten. In Southern California, we have a big surfing community, much like you do in Australia. It turned out that every single one of those people just so happened to be in the water with someone who knew something about first aid. I mean, what's the likelihood of that? Well, our water community, many of them are, they were off-duty nurses, firemen, policemen, so they'd all had some first aid training. In addition, they were very quick to respond to blood loss. So the first order of business was, okay, where are you bleeding from? Putting pressure, and then we got to stop blood loss, right? Immediate call, 911 call to EMS. Okay, so the other cool thing about Southern California is along the entire coastline, we have cell coverage. And that is not the case in many places. So that means, everybody's got cell phones on the beach. They can jump up, get to the phone, call EMS. EMS is there, so you have paramedics on site within 15 minutes of the person hitting the beach. Okay, so now the lifeguards are being taught, when they're taking somebody out of the water, carry them out of the water, even if they're a much bigger person, because dragging them through the sand is packing sand into those wounds. And those people are going to be on an operating table for hours while the surgeons debride, get all that sand out of the wound. Helicopter comes to pick them up, to take them to a trauma center. Make sure the person's completely covered so that sand from the helicopter doesn't get blown into the wound. These are all things our lifeguards are trained to deal with, know how to deal with, have in their kits, packing wounds with trauma gauze. What's the best way to stop bleeding and stabilize that person before EMTs get there? And then the study basically found that from the time a person's bitten, they're in a major trauma center within 30 minutes. So we've had 2 of those people who are on the verge of going into shock. By the way, if you start going into shock in the field, you have about a 17% chance of surviving once you're in shock. So the fact that these people had been bitten so severely and were able to survive that, many of them are back in the water, by the way, really is a testament to not just our lifeguards and their training, but also Southern California puts a lot of resources into it because we have a huge population, right? So we have 39 trauma centers across Southern California alone. It's probably the highest density anywhere in the world. So, I mean, those are the sorts of things that make the difference between somebody being bitten by a white shark and surviving.
Far out, yeah. That's so interesting. I'm listening to your talk, and it's the protocols and the effort that's gone into it is incredible. And I can't not to sit here and try and compare not just the effort and the protocols, but also just the differences in the layout. And when you spoke about reception, having phone reception, that's such a luxury. I feel like that is more of a built-up area, whereas Australia feels quite remote. And I think the lifeguard program is exceptional. And I think our lifeguards are pretty skilled, but the beaches that are lifeguarded and patrolled here in Australia are usually not the ones that an incident goes down.
Right.
So I think we can certainly learn a lot and take a lot from your approach, but yeah, it can feel like it comes down to the accountability of the surfers or the swimmers who are doing so in their local national parks or their local areas where things aren't patrolled, and they've got to take it upon themselves. But there's so many things that can be done, like knowing the first aid, having the pack there, and you doing that yourself and knowing how to utilize that equipment when it's needed. And then you spoke about earlier before you spoke about the psychologists and how they're starting to try and understand the impacts across the board. Like, I have written from the notes last time before we move on to the similarities and differences in Australia. Like, you were saying that you show a kid, an infant, or someone before they've been programmed a spider or a snake, and it's inbuilt into them for fear. But then you show them a shark and nothing happens. Can you talk about what was found out during that study?
Yeah, this is where my psychology colleague was describing this to me, and I was thinking, humans co-evolve with these terrestrial predators and things that can hurt us, and what's really cool is we have these innate responses to it. So they did this experiment. They showed babies, a picture of a spider, and they react, right? It's just a drawing. It doesn't even have to really look like a spider, but anything that's shaped like a spider, they should react. And that's an innate response that helps keep an infant potentially safe, right? Same thing with snake. A snake, they'll respond back. But then they showed them pictures of other things that they wouldn't encounter, like a whale or a shark, and no response, right? So what that tells us, and what the psychologist really focuses on, because her specialty is fear, understanding how humans deal with fear. We've been taught to fear sharks. So that's different from an innate fear of like snakes and spiders, which you could overcome that fear, but it's a lot harder to overcome that fear because it's baked in, right? As opposed to a fear that you've been taught. So, that's the encouraging thing for folks in my field, which means if we educate right, we inform right, we can actually reduce a lot of that fear and get people to kind of maybe think about the animals a little differently, which changes their behavior, which then keeps them safer when they're in the presence of those animals. So I think, that's the key to understanding all these things is giving people that power of reducing that kind of irrational fear.
Now we're currently, it's been a great white chat, which is where I wanted it to go, and because that's where you strongly work. Now in Australia over the last, you would have saw early on what happened this year. There was a bull shark spate of incidents, a fatality, unfortunately, and then some pretty severe injuries that occurred. And from that, there's reactivity, and some of that reactivity is to try and manage, control, cull, whatever word you want to use. Now I think to America as a country, and like there's bears, there's wolves, there's protected species that have a similar fear through people than sharks and have a long history towards them. And so, how are things managed there in terms of bears and the terrestrial side of things? And what do you think about when you see Australia acting in that way?
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. I just went to this conference this past year called Human Dimensions. And basically, these are people who, in this particular Human Dimensions group, are ones that deal with wildlife-human interactions. So most of the people, I was one of the few marine persons there who was studying something that wasn't terrestrial. So most of the people there were studying wolves, bears, mountain lions, elephants, tigers, lions, things like that, right? Animals that occur on land. And in almost all cases, humans have reduced those populations out of fear, right? So it wasn't actual necessity for safety. Quite often it was, these things could cause harm, so we're going to cull their populations, we're going to reduce their numbers. And we did that, dozens and dozens of years ago. And then it was probably about 20 or 30 years ago that biologists started saying, these ecosystems without these critical predators are not the same. Those predators serve a really important role in keeping those things healthy. And, probably the best example of that was the return of wolves to Yellowstone, right? And what we saw and how that influenced things like elk. And then suddenly trees started coming back that they hadn't seen in years because the wolves were doing what the wolves do. They were chasing elk and scaring elk from certain areas, and that allowed the ecosystem to come back. What I found really interesting about that was that in the US, we're still struggling with that, right? If a mountain lion bites somebody in California, Fish and Game wardens will go out, try to search that animal down, and they'll shoot it. They'll take it out. And, there's a lot of people that are kind of opposed to that, but that's something we've always done, right? So it's part of a culture that, despite the science, we're having a hard time letting go of that culture, right? What I find really interesting about sharks in the US is that, despite the fact that the US has the highest shark bite incident anywhere in the world, remember Florida has 40 bites per year, right? Florida, that's just Florida. There's never been a shark control program in the state of Florida, or a culling program. In California, where we've had high numbers of fatalities attributed to white sharks, we've never had a shark control program that was government supported. It's just never happened. Hawaii did. Hawaii had 2 shark control programs, one in the 50s, one in the 70s, both following fatalities on children. And then in the 90s, the idea was broached again, and the state said no. So what I find most fascinating about the US history with shark bites is that, despite having the most bites anywhere in the world, we've never had really government-supported shark culling. So the US is probably what I would consider to be one of the most litigious countries in the world. So how is that possible? Right? I mean, we sue over ridiculous things all the time. So we actually looked into this. We looked into records. Yeah, people have tried to sue municipalities in the US for shark bites, and the judges almost all rule shark bites an act of God. There's no way somebody could do anything about that. So in the US, where lawyers are true land sharks, no municipality has ever been sued because of the shark bite. So what I find interesting, after talking with my colleagues in Australia, South Africa, Reunion Island, is I think once you start down that path of doing shark control, much like our mountain lion, wolf, bear thing, it is very hard to stop after somebody gets bitten or killed by one of those animals. It's almost like it becomes ingrained in your culture, and it becomes very difficult to stop despite the science. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing here, because people would argue it's about liability. We're trying to reduce liability, and culling reduces liability. In reality, it doesn't. And if you're not liable anyway, then how is that helping? So other than making people feel better, it's a little vengeful almost, right? Makes people feel better, like they got the culprit, we've done some justice or something like that. You know, the scientific data supporting its efficacy is not great, right? And the places where it has worked, you've really had to hammer those populations pretty hard for decades, right? So we're not talking about going out and surgically taking out a half dozen big sharks here and there. We're talking about doing it for decades. And you lower those numbers down low enough, sure, you can probably drive that bite rate down on humans pretty low. But at what cost? What ecological cost? What financial cost? And in my opinion, it doesn't serve the public because it's not teaching them how to share these habitats with these other animals that we have to share with. So I think that's the big difference that I see between the US and Australia.
So if a mountain lion or a bear protects, an individual or a family, is it still then hunted directly after?
If it bites someone?
To this day? Yeah.
Most cases, yes.
Yeah. And do you support that?
Not really. Well, because I don't see the scientific evidence that supports the need, right? If you can show me that animal is going to likely bite a person again, sure, but where's the evidence for that? And out of precaution, people will go, well, we don't want to take that risk. What if it did? Then I'd be the person that said, oh, let that mountain lion do its own thing. I mean, the other alternatives that they do use in California sometimes is they'll dart the animal and then translocate it somewhere, right? But what we're learning about many of these animals is, they have home ranges. They go back to, you could translocate them 1,000 miles, they'll turn around, walk 1,000 miles to go back to their old haunt, right? So that's very different from sharks. We don't necessarily see those behaviors in sharks. We see repeatability in terms of habitat use, but not defense of habitat. So I think, there's some differences between those. And, mammals are total different beast than sharks. Their habitat has become so fragmented and patchwork that they get channeled and focused in certain places. And sharks, not necessarily. They've got plenty of open space to move.
And it could be it sounds like with the approach that California goes to, it'd be asking questions around that incident, I'm sure. Did they understand the risk? How were they acting? What precautions did they take? And what season was it perhaps? They're the sort of things that potentially could be asked there. Now, coming back to Oz and starting to focus on any crossovers, I think that what's coming to mind is there isn't many aggregation sites here. There's just not. I think there's a lot of talk around sort of Stockton Beach, which is sort of between Newcastle and the mid-north coast, basically, as being a breeding ground as such, but that's still a bit cloudy. But in terms of there's no place where whites go and hang, but there are hotspots along our coast for activity, but it's not like they're all just playing and doing this controlled manner. It feels, well, I'm not going to try and say it is, but it feels roguer, and it feels more unpredictable, more uncertain. And you were saying before that you don't take bumps into account, but it's not like our numbers of fatalities or even severe injury have gone up, but in the last 5 years, there's just been an increased presence, and with that, surfers noticing a change in behaviour, feeling more threatened, more bumps, which, with a slightly different scenario, that could be a whole different kettle of fish. And I experienced that. I had a white come at me really aggressively, in in predator mode, and a millimeter or a half a second difference, like we might not be here having this chat. And so these things I feel like need to be taken into account. But what do you notice in terms of like the great white behaviour here in Australia versus that of California, where you're witnessing a lot of things?
So before I get to that, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So since your experience, have you changed your behavior? Has it changed how you use the ocean?
Massively.
How so?
Let's like education, number one.
Okay.
Afterwards, just have been on a journey. It's a funny word, but I can't come up with a different word right now. But just wanted to, I think when I'm fearful and distrustful and uncertain about something, I want to try and learn as much as I can to try and build on that. So a lot of research. I just pay a heck of a lot more attention. I think originally it was me, surf, surf, surf.
Yeah.
And now I'm sort of like, all right, why am I going in today? What's this for? What's my relationship like with this place? It's made me more empathetic. It's made me want to listen more. It's made me want to try and help the situation as opposed to, I guess, roll over or feel helpless. I think there is a way to move forward. And yeah, I mean, they're just, I could probably rattle them off all day personally, but they're the main points. Yeah. Why do you ask?
Well, so this is something we're really interested in, right? Our goal, one of our goals of the research and the education, the outreach is to help Americans in particular be better risk assessors, right? So the problem that we run into in California and many places in the US is that people that use the ocean I call it the Disneyland effect. So when you go to Disneyland and you go on a ride, you assume that the ride is safe, right? It's been inspected. It's been designed by engineers. There are people that are testing it to make sure it is safe. Otherwise, if you got hurt, you could sue, right? When people go in the ocean, there are a group of people who are like, kind of like you were saying, they are there to surf. And it's the ocean is there for them to surf. They don't perceive it or think of it as a home for other animals necessarily. It's a playground for them. So this Disneyland effect, this is where we spend a lot of time talking with our lifeguards, right? Because that's their job. Their job is to keep people who go into the water coming out safely. That's it. That's what they perceive as their job. And they may post signs and they may warn people, look, there's a rip current right here. Please move down this way. Avoid this. This is a rip current. Public goes, I don't know what a rip current is. The next thing you know, out they go, right? Screaming, yelling, help, I can't get back. And the lifeguards go pull that person who they just said, just move down here a bit more. The current's going to pull you down here. Stay away from this part. So they're constantly wanting to know, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with people's not paying attention to what's happening to them when they're in the ocean? How do we get them to take that experience or that responsibility a little bit more seriously, right? So, and I'm not saying you didn't as a surfer, right? I mean, you probably knew anytime you went out, you could have got bonked in the head and knocked unconscious and could have possibly drowned or broke your neck on a wave, But it's then dealing with things that live there that move, not just a wave, not just a rip current. It's the other animals that live there. And one of the things that I think we're starting to see, and my favorite conversations are from older dudes, right? So older dudes have been around a long time, right? So they'll go, this was never a problem 50 years ago. And they would go, how come it wasn't a problem 50 years ago? Because there were no sharks left 50 years ago. They were gone. They were fished out, So you didn't have as many things to worry about. Now you do. You have more things who naturally occur there. So I think for some people, it's that sliding baseline, right? That the ocean is not the same as it was 25, 30 years ago. For newer, younger people going in the ocean, they don't know that yet, right? It is what it is currently. So what that means is, in terms of our education outreach, our risk training, if you will, that you have to deal with each one of those people differently because their experiences are different. So, for example, you are probably much more receptive to some of our educational information because of your experience that you had, right? But what do we do about a person who hasn't had that experience, who goes, it's my playground. I'm going to go out. The surf's great. I'm going to go out. I'm not going to worry about it. And we're not saying they should worry about that. What we're saying is you should be aware. I always say this. You spent any appreciable time in the water off California, I guarantee a white shark swam right by you and you did not know it. And yet you're still here. So it's those sorts of things. And how do you get that to resonate with someone to go, okay, how do I change my behavior maybe a little bit to accommodate for that?
Yeah, I would have been one of those people who I would. It's funny. Like when I say me, surf, that can have a bit of a stereotype with it. But Australians are quite. I'm going to go into bat quite hard from here because they are people who care about their environment, and they care about the things that live in it, and they advocate for its privacy and its safety in terms of like environmental things that are going to potentially happen. Going from coal and to things that are going to affect our ocean, like we'll stand up for that. And I'm someone who's the same. And it's not that I wouldn't have taken that information on, not out of a naivety or a disrespect, but just feeling like I don't need it. Like I've got this good relationship. I'm safe. I've been surfing for 30 years. I'm good, and then it just changed in the click of a finger. Just let me, I can't remember where I was going. I just need a sec. But, and so I think, as you mentioned, America's never had that shark control thing. So that it's not even an option. But whereas the old boys here are now saying it's not like it used to be. But now that they've been protected for 30 years and we want to feel safe in the ocean, but all of a sudden, like the numbers, even though the scientists are saying that they're not increasing that much, they have to be increasing slightly. And that slight increase or the behavioural changes that are occurring are just making us feel more unsafe. There's more exposure there. And so it's not about comparing it to before. It's just going like, this is feeling a little bit ridiculous. But yes, we want to enjoy the ocean. We feel like we should be able to. And yes, we want them to be looked after as well. We just want to coexist. But right now it doesn't feel balanced, so that's where it gets complicated.
No, I completely understand these things, having been to places like South Africa and Australia and Reunion Island and all those places, Brazil, where you'll have spates of incidents that'll occur. I totally understand those perceptions, right? The question really comes down to, are there other ways to deal with it, right? So if we go back to the way we used to deal with things all the time, and we're still having to go back to them, that tells me that they're not working. Now we have more people. That makes it more difficult, right? More people are using the ocean than ever before for a wider array of recreational activities than ever before. And we've had populations that have been reduced and now are coming back. And we don't know whether the behaviors that we're seeing now are the same behaviors that existed 20, 30, 50, 60, 100 years ago, or whether those behaviors are adaptive, which we assume they are, right? The animals are modifying the behavior to deal with the environment that they live in now, just like we do. So, the question is, are there better ways to deal with this? I think ultimately, and I'm sure if I talk to you, I could talk to 1,000 surfers here, 1,000 ocean swimmers. And I said, look, if you had your best case scenario, what would you want? And they would go, I just want to be able to swim. I want the animals there. I just don't want to have to worry. And I'm like, okay, now that's the tricky part, right? So, we can deal with a lot of things, but we cannot fix your worry, right? Because there's some people that worry about everything, right? I'm worried about driving to the beach. That's my biggest worry. My biggest worry is driving to the beach. But once I get to the beach, I'm cool, right? So, I think these are the things that we really need to address, and they're not necessarily things that we can do to the environment or to the animals to really address the problem. It's maybe a bit more about us. So, how do we do that? And are there things that I, as a scientist, can provide that help people make those decisions or those realizations? Like, things don't feel right today. I just don't think I'm going to go in the water. Now, that's a personal decision, right? That's a personal decision, and why that creeped into your head, or I've been out on the water by myself, which I always tell people, probably not a good idea. And then I get that little creepy feeling in the back of my head, back of my neck, and I think, you know what? I'm going to paddle in. I'm going to swim in. I don't know what does it. I don't know what makes me feel that way. It doesn't hurt. I don't feel like a chicken by getting out of the water. Maybe when I was younger, I might have a bit more, but now I feel like old and wise is maybe better. But, I pay attention to that, whereas I never used to. So I wonder if things like that don't help. Because at the end of the day, it really comes down to, you should be able to surf, and you should be able to swim, and you should be able to do all those ocean recreations. And the sharks that live there should be able to swim and eat the things that they need to eat, and all should be good. The question is, can you live with the worry? And is there something we can do about that?
What do you think Australia could do differently across the board,
well,
like in any aspect?
I think Australia's trying a bunch of different things, which I think is the smartest thing to do, right? And not everybody's going to like everything, right? Some people are going to go, oh, we need to get past the culling. We need to get beyond that. It just becomes kind of, becomes a little contrary when you go, okay, we're going to protect the species because we're worried about it. But now there's maybe a few too many, and we're worried about it for a different reason. So now we're not going to protect it. Those things don't send good messages, right? If your goal is to, protect the environment, that sort of thing. But I think education, informing people, why we see differences in behaviors between places for the same species, I find fascinating. I think it's really kind of interesting. When I talk to my Australian colleagues all the time, like Charlie and Paul Butcher and those guys, I'm like, why do your guys' white sharks do these things? Ours don't do that. And they'll go, well, why do yours do that? And ours don't do that. So I think understanding those things, sharing those things with the public helps. I don't want people to think we have all the answers. We don't. We're not even close. But we are learning something. And the one thing that I do know is, here's a personal example. When we first started doing this work, we were diving in water where the visibility, I could not see my hand. At the end of my arm, I could not see my hand. And yet we're putting receivers in there to listen for tag sharks. And as we jump in the water, I literally see a 3-meter shark dorsal fin swim right by me. Okay, so me and my team are diving there. We know, we could see from the drone, there are dozens of white sharks in these waters. We have never seen a white shark underwater. We've been diving at these beaches, hundreds, if not thousands of dives in zero viz, and we've never seen one of those sharks underwater. We know they're there. They probably swim right by us. We couldn't see it if it did. But what 7 years ago when we started this project, I would have been very hesitant about putting any students in the water there, just because I didn't feel it was safe. I didn't know. But now that I know, we've been doing it year after year after year after year. I don't even think about it.
Now, you say you're sharing, which is great, with Charlie and Paul Butcher. And Paul was actually, because he's only 2.5 hours up the road.
Yeah.
So my incident was captured on a drone. So Paul was the initial person I went to. Now, you're sharing info and sort of comparing what the whites in Cali are doing to the whites here.
Mm-hmm.
Are you also advising them, or are they paying attention to your collaboration with the universities and the I can't remember what are the good drawers names again? what do you call them? Someone who can do good
Or
art. You were saying animation,
infographics. Yeah.
animators and
Yeah.
things. You know,
Yeah.
are they paying attention to that side of things, and are you sharing the positive effects that are coming from those?
Absolutely. So, for example, I know Charlie is taking advantage of all the resources he has at Flinders, right? So I think he's now taking greater advantage of that. And Australia was like one of the first places to actually start to look at people's perceptions of sharks. So some of the first studies were done in Australia. So we took that from you guys and said, okay, we really need to do this for the US. And then, of course, what we need to do is compare across countries. That's the next step, is to see, do Australians think differently than Americans? And if so, in what perspective, and what shaped that? So these are the sorts of things that I think are really helpful. The White Shark conference that we had, in South Australia was great. I got to meet some lifeguards. I got to talk to some water safety personnel that were there. Australia's trying pretty hard to deal with the problem, even though you've got very different situations on the East Coast, West Coast, and South Coast, right? So there is no one size fits all. There is no silver bullet. It's let's try different things and see what works. But at the end of the day, I honestly believe education is going to be the key. It's going to be the cheapest, most effective way to keep people and sharks safe.
Cool. Just one last question that might have a few angles on it. So I wanted to chat about the Northern Cali side of things and what happens when, you're speaking of 3 meters, then they might start to shift out of your area. Where you notice they're going, are they moving south or are they moving north? And what's going on? What differences do you notice in Northern California where it is cooler, the sharks are bigger, there's more wildlife up there, and it's just got that reputation? Because I feel like, as I mentioned before, your Northern Cali feels a lot like our Western Australia and South Australia, where if you do have an incident with a shark, it's probably going to be a submarine-sized shark, and a lot of these, a lot of the factors that you try, like the first aid and things, you're like, well, if this one gets you, it's sort of could be game over. And also, there is a lot of sort of anecdotal reports out of South Oz that they're not just taking a quick nibble and then realizing that, I don't want this human. They're actually toying with that human, and sometimes for minutes at a time, and then consuming the human whole. And so, what happens in that sort of adult phase that may change the behavior to a juvenile?
Yeah. So that's kind of interesting, and I think kind of describes some of the similarities we see with Eastern Australia, right? Southern, in the southern part, right? So you've got the nursery, which is kind of up on the East Coast, right? And what we see is our nurseries are in Southern California. Now the adults, what makes, I think, Australian and Southern California or California coast different is that the offshore islands that we have, which are only 50 kilometers off the coast, are uninhabited, and that's where all the seals are. So seals, hundreds of thousands of seals and sea lions there. So if you're a white shark that likes to eat seals and sea lions, marine mammals, that is the best place to go. And those animals haul out, so they're up on land, but they have to go back in the water. So if you're an adult or a sub-adult and you want a high quality meal like that, like the Neptunes, that's the best place to go. Southern California has lovely beaches that would be great haul outs for seals, but we have people using those beaches and their dogs year round. So there is no room for the seals. Seals have been kicked off the beaches for 100 years. You go to Cape Cod, where I grew up, there were never seals when I was there. And it was rare to see adult white sharks. Now there are seals all over those beaches, and there are white sharks at those beaches. And what makes the Cape different is during the winter, nobody's on those beaches but the seals. So the seals call those beaches theirs. And then when the summer comes, people start showing up at the beach. Seals are like, we're not leaving. This is our beach. So now you have people sharing the beach at a seal rookery, and adult white sharks are there to feed on those seals. So it's a very different situation than we see in Southern California. Central California is very similar to your, Southern Australia. It's rocky. You have pinniped colonies, things like that, sea lion colonies. All that activity is drawing sharks in, and sharks are actually forming feeding aggregations around the best sites. And some individuals within the population have been doing that year after year after year. So the Stanford group has documented this. There's a group up in Monterey that have been tagging there, identifying sharks by their dorsal fins for 35 years. So the same individuals return year after year after year. So those behaviors are pretty well characterized. But as the population grows, those places are getting too crowded. And it's not safe for a seal to be there. So seals are looking for new rookeries as well. So we're seeing our seal populations rise. They've risen over the last 100 years. Sea lion populations probably at the highest it's ever been. Elephant seal populations have recovered, all of these from the verge of extinction in less than 100 years. But most of the places where you find them, there are fewer people. So that's where the sharks are. So this starting around the end of summer, the adults start coming back from their open ocean migration, and we have no clue what they're doing out there, really. And then they're moving along the coast trying to find seals. Those are the best meals for them. And they'll stay until the elephant seals leave. And when the elephant seals leave, that usually initiates that open ocean migration for a lot of the adults. But we're noticing that not all the adults do that anymore. Some of them stay year round. And the question is why? Why is the behavior changing? Is it based on the population? So is there so many sharks now that the competition's gone up at those places that they're looking for new places? Or have our seal and sea lion populations, our female sea lions here, more residential? Males migrate all the way up to Northern California or Alaska, but females stick around. So if you're a white shark, why go out to the middle of the Pacific? Why not just hang around? As long as the water temperature is okay for you for the winter, why not stay? So these are the sorts of things that we're starting to see, but we don't know what causes them. And the animals still are highly mobile. So when you think about a baby white shark, we've measured travels 3,000 miles in its first year. That's a migration. Adult will migrate 10,000 miles in a year. So when you think about that kind of mobility, and then the fact that they're drawn back to these places, you're putting sharks and people and seals together in sometimes the same places, like the Central California coast, and Monterey is a good example. The woman that was bitten while swimming. There's a bite there 2 summers ago at the exact same location. It wasn't fatal, but another large shark. These are in that 15 to 16 foot range. So these are big sharks. They're there at the right time of year. There's a growing sea lion population in Monterey. But again, these people are bitten. That woman was bitten once, literally once, by that shark. That was it. No flesh was removed. One bite. She likely drowned as a result. But, that seeing flesh removed is really rare. We just don't see it that often in California.
Is this the one before Christmas you're referring to? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, mate, we've covered a lot of things, and I think it's so interesting. I could, I said before, I'll have you for an hour. It's now been an hour and a half, so I'm courteous of your time, but courteous, sorry. But yeah, just thanks so much for just going in all those angles, sharing what you're up to over there, trying to make the comparisons over here. I agree. I think we're doing a lot, with what we have. And as you said, it is a new thing, and funding plays a part, and everyone's got a different opinion. Trying to keep everyone happy feels like a struggle, but the more chats we have, hopefully we can start moving in the right place. So I think your info, about your successes and your protocols and programs over there is going to be really helpful for people to hear. So I really appreciate your time. And I just want to know, because when I was researching you, it said you're retiring soon. You're not, are you? Please tell me you're not.
I did.
Yeah, you did?
Yeah, I did. I retired from being a professor. So Yeah. So I just retired. They just are hiring my replacement right now to take over the Shark Lab. I gave it, 27 good years. I'm not done. I'll be doing other things. I'll be done being a professor.
Yeah.
So,
well, you just gotten back from shredding the power at Utah,
yeah,
so probably a bit
exactly.
more of that going down.
My wife is like, yeah, because she retired 2 years ago. So she's like, it's time to play. We put our time in. Yeah.
Oh, big shoes to fill. Hope that next person, steps in well, and all the best, mate. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Cheers.
If you enjoyed this chat and any of the subjects, info, and stories within, and you think someone you know would like to hear it, please share it around. If you have any ideas, new or old, in support or contrary to what has been spoken about in any of the apps, please send through to my Instagram at Brett Burcher or the Crossing the Tideline Instagram at Crossing the Tideline. If I could please ask to do so in a manner that the message can be taken on board and not in a way that makes it difficult to be received and doesn't invite discussion. Please just come from a place of respect. Audience opinion, observation, etc. It's crucial to help develop my understanding and the greater combo at large. You guys are on the ground daily, surfing, swimming, diving, fishing, chatting to people in places and at times where data simply can't. Data is extremely helpful and plays its course, and so do you. A cool guest, subject for a chat, a story, your thoughts. I'm all ears, so get in touch. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, have a great week.